The brass key felt heavier in my palm than it should have. Standing on the front porch of 4247 Maple Grove Drive, I stared at the burgundy door that was about to become mine. Not rented. Not borrowed. Mine. After 12 years of saving every dollar I could scrape together from my engineering salary, working double shifts on weekends and eating more ramen than any grown man should, I was finally here. Daddy, are we really going to live here? Aaliyah's voice carried that mixture of excitement and disbelief that 7-year-olds do so perfectly. She bounced on her toes, her curly pigtails dancing as she took in the manicured lawn and the white picket fence that looked like something out of a magazine. We sure are. Baby girl, I said, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. I glanced at Danielle, who was wiping away tears she thought I couldn't see. My wife had been my anchor through all of this. Through the late nights when I questioned whether we'd ever make it out of our cramped apartment. Through the rejection letters from banks who found creative ways to say no without saying why. Through the real estate agents who suddenly discovered properties were no longer available the moment they met us in person. But here we were. In Brookhaven Estates, one of Atlanta's most sought-after suburban neighborhoods. The kind of place where kids rode bikes in the street without fear, where Halloween meant full-size candy bars, and where the schools had computer labs instead of metal detectors. I slid the key into the lock and it turned with a satisfying click. The door swung open to reveal hardwood floors that gleamed in the afternoon sun, crown molding that I'd dreamed about for years, and a living room with windows that looked out onto a backyard big enough for Aaliyah to run around in. Welcome home. Richardson family, Danielle whispered, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. That feeling lasted exactly 4 hours. I was in the garage, unpacking boxes and setting up my workbench, when I heard voices from the driveway next door. Through the thin wall, I could make out a man's voice, gruff and agitated. Did you see them moving in? I told you this neighborhood was going to hell. A woman's voice responded, equally sharp. I knew it. I just knew it. The moment they started accepting those people, it was only a matter of time. I froze, a box of tools still in my hands. Those people. The phrase hit me like a punch to the gut, familiar and nauseating. I'd heard it whispered in conference rooms when they thought I couldn't hear. I'd seen it in the eyes of store clerks who followed me a little too closely. I'd felt it in the pause that came after I introduced myself to new colleagues. Maybe they're just visiting, the woman continued. You know, helping the real owners move in or something. Look at that U-Haul truck, Karen. That's not a social visit. I set down the box carefully, my hands steadier than I felt. Through the small garage window, I caught my first glimpse of the voices. A white man in his 50s, broad-shouldered with graying hair beneath a red MAGA cap. Next to him stood a blonde woman, her arms crossed, both of them staring directly at our house like we were some kind of infestation. We should call the HOA, the woman, Karen apparently, said. Find out what's really going on here. Already ahead of you, the man replied. Rick Thompson doesn't let his neighborhood go to shit on his watch. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was supposed to be our fresh start, our piece of the American dream, the place where Aaliyah would grow up safe and secure, where she'd never have to wonder if she belonged. But standing in my own garage, listening to my new neighbors discuss me like I was a problem to be solved, I felt the familiar weight settle on my shoulders. The weight of being the only one. The weight of representing not just myself, but every black person who might dare to dream of living somewhere like this. The weight of knowing that no matter how hard I worked, how much money I made, how respectfully I carried myself, to some people I would always be those people. Jamal? Danielle appeared in the garage doorway, concern creasing her forehead. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced a smile and gestured toward the boxes, just overwhelmed by all this unpacking. You know how it is. But Danielle had been married to me for 8 years. She knew when I was lying. Her eyes flicked toward the wall that separated us from the Thompsons, and understanding dawned in her expression. What did you hear? She asked quietly. Nothing we haven't heard before, I said, which was both true and completely inadequate, because hearing it in a boardroom was one thing. Hearing it from the people who lived next door to your daughter was something else entirely. Aaliyah's laughter drifted in from the backyard, where she was exploring every corner of her new domain. The sound was pure joy, untainted by the poison I'd just absorbed. I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever it took, I was going to protect that laughter. This was our home now. We had every right to be here, and I'd be damned if I was going to let anyone make us feel otherwise. But as I returned to unpacking, I couldn't shake the feeling that Rick Thompson and his wife were just the beginning. In neighborhoods like this, racism rarely came alone. It traveled in packs, fed off validation, grew stronger when it sensed weakness. The thing was, they had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a black family moving into their precious neighborhood and immediately assumed we didn't belong. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I hadn't just bought a house in Brookhaven Estates. I'd helped build it. Every foundation, every frame, every carefully measured angle of every roof in this development had been overseen by Richardson engineering consultants. My consultants, my calculations, my signature on the safety inspections that had allowed families to move in and call these houses home, including the house that Rick and Karen Thompson lived in. I smiled to myself as I arranged my tools on the workbench. They wanted to find out what was really going on here? Fine, let them dig. Let them call the HOA, the city, whoever they thought might help them get rid of the problem next door. Because sooner or later, they were going to discover that their biggest problem wasn't that a black family had moved into their neighborhood. Their biggest problem was that a black man owned it. Sunday morning in Brookhaven Estates was supposed to be peaceful, church bells chiming in the distance, the smell of bacon drifting from kitchen windows, kids riding bikes in lazy circles on the sidewalk. But peace, I was learning, was a privilege that had to be earned in neighborhoods like this. I was in the front yard, installing a new mailbox, our name Richardson, etched in bold letters across brushed steel, when I first noticed the pattern. Every few minutes, a car would slow down as it passed our house. Not stop, nothing that dramatic. Just slow down enough for the occupants to get a good look, their faces pressed against windows like we were some kind of exhibit. "Daddy, why do people keep staring at our house?" Aaliyah had noticed too, perched on the front steps in her Sunday dress, a white confection with tiny pink flowers that Danielle had spent too much money on but couldn't resist. "They're just curious about the new neighbors." "Sweetheart," I said, tightening the final screw on the mailbox post. "People like to know who's moving into their neighborhood." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that in the 3 days since we'd moved in, I'd counted 17 cars that had slowed down for a look. I'd memorized their makes and models. The silver BMW from 2 streets over, the blue Chevy pickup with the Confederate flag bumper sticker, the white Lexus SUV that had passed by 4 separate times. "Can I go play in the backyard?" Aaliyah asked, already fidgeting with the urge to run. "Stay where I can see you," I called after her as she bounded toward the back gate. At 7, she still believed the world was fundamentally good, that people were friendly, that home was a safe place. I wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. The sound of a screen door slamming made me look up. Karen Thompson was emerging from her house, dressed for church in a floral dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was teased and sprayed into a helmet of compliance, and her jewelry caught the morning sun like tiny spotlights. She walked to her mailbox with deliberate slowness, clearly wanting to be seen. When she bent to retrieve her mail, she made sure to glance over at me with an expression I'd learned to recognize, the look of someone trying to figure out exactly what they were dealing with. "Morning," I called out, because that's what neighbors do. That's what I'd been taught growing up. You acknowledge the people around you, you show respect. You extend kindness first and let others decide whether to return it. Karen straightened, clutching her mail like a shield. For a moment I thought she might actually respond, but then her eyes traveled from my face to my work clothes to the tools scattered around the mailbox, and something shifted in her expression. HOA regulations clearly state that any modifications to mailboxes must be pre-approved, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I hope you submitted the proper paperwork." I paused, my hand still on the mailbox. The thing was, she was right about the regulations. As an engineer, I'd read every line of the HOA covenant when we'd bought the house. But she was wrong about the paperwork. "Already taken care of," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket and scrolling to the email approval I'd received 3 days ago. "Would you like to see the documentation?" The offer clearly caught her off guard. She took a half step back, her eyes narrowing. "That won't be necessary. I'm sure you followed the proper procedures." The pause before followed was loaded with implication. She'd expected to catch me in violation, to have grounds for the first of what I suspected would be many complaints. Finding out that I'd actually done everything by the book seemed to frustrate her more than please her. "Beautiful morning for church," I said, gesturing toward her outfit. "We're still looking for the right congregation. Any recommendations?" This was dangerous territory, I knew. In neighborhoods like this, church wasn't just about faith. It was about social networks, about proving you belonged to the right kind of community. But it was also a test. Would she recommend the church she attended, knowing we might show up? Or would she find a polite way to steer us elsewhere? "There are several options in the area," she said carefully. "I'm sure you'll find something that suits your needs." Another pause, another loaded phrase. Something that suits your needs. Not something welcoming. Not somewhere you'd feel at home. Something suitable for people like us. "Thank you," I said, maintaining the pleasant tone that had been drilled into me since childhood. "Kill them with kindness," my father had always said. "Make them work harder to justify their hatred." Karen nodded stiffly and turned to go back inside, but stopped when Rick Thompson's voice boomed from their garage. "Karen, you see the news this morning?" She glanced at me nervously before answering. "What news?" "Property values," he called back. "Down 3% in mixed neighborhoods over the past year." 3%. "I told you this was going to happen." The words hit the morning air like a slap. "Mixed neighborhoods." He might as well have said it directly. "Your presence is making our investments worth less." I felt the familiar anger rising in my chest, the heat that started between my shoulder blades and crept up my neck. But I also felt something else, a cold, calculating calm that had served me well in boardrooms and construction sites, where I was often the only black face in the room. "Actually," I called out, loud enough for Rick to hear, "recent studies show that diversity typically increases property values over time. More diverse communities tend to have better schools, more amenities, and stronger economic growth. I'd be happy to share the data if you're interested." The silence that followed was deafening. Through the garage door, I could see Rick's silhouette frozen in place. Karen's face had gone pale beneath her makeup. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said quickly, backing toward her house. "No problem at all," I replied. "I have all the numbers. Being an engineer, I tend to keep track of these things." Engineer. I let the word hang in the air like a challenge. Let them chew on that for a while. Let them reconcile their assumptions about who I was with the reality of what I did for a living. As the Thompsons retreated to their house, I finished installing the mailbox and stepped back to admire my work. Richardson, our name, in gleaming letters claiming this space as ours. From the backyard, Aaliyah's laughter drifted over the fence. She'd found a butterfly and was chasing it around the garden, her church dress already gathering grass stains that Danielle would fuss about later. The sound was pure and joyful and completely oblivious to the tension that had just played out in the front yard. I made another promise to myself. Whatever games the Thompsons wanted to play, whatever subtle warfare they wanted to wage, they would not touch that laughter. They would not steal my daughter's joy or make her question whether she belonged in her own backyard. But as I gathered my tools and headed inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the opening move. Rick Thompson struck me as the type of man who didn't give up easily, who saw every interaction as a battle to be won. And Karen seemed like the type who would recruit allies who would turn neighborhood coffee gatherings into strategy sessions. Fine, let them strategize. Let them organize. Let them pull whatever strings they thought they had, because they had no idea that the man they were targeting had spent the last decade pulling strings of his own. Engineering wasn't just about buildings and calculations. It was about systems, about understanding how all the pieces fit together, about knowing exactly which support beam to adjust when you wanted to bring the whole structure down. And Rick and Karen Thompson were about to discover that their perfect little neighborhood had been built on a foundation they didn't understand, overseen by someone they'd underestimated, and approved by a man who was getting very tired of being told he didn't belong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a credit card offer and a catalog for overpriced outdoor furniture. Official HOA letterhead, my name spelled correctly, address confirmed, but the content made my blood pressure spike. Dear Mr. Richardson, the Brookhaven Estates Homeowners Association has received several concerns regarding recent changes to property aesthetics and compliance with community standards. A mandatory meeting has been scheduled for Thursday, October 15th at 7 p.m. in the community center. Your attendance is required to address these matters. Sincerely, Margaret Hayes, HOA President. Several concerns, I muttered, reading the letter again. We'd been here exactly 1 week. 7 days. In that time, I'd installed one pre-approved mailbox, planted flowers in the front bed, and had the lawn professionally mowed. If those counted as concerns, then the real problem wasn't with our property maintenance. What's that? Danielle looked up from her laptop where she was preparing lesson plans for her new teaching position at the local elementary school. She'd managed to transfer from her old school district, a small miracle that had made our move to Brookhaven possible. I handed her the letter and watched her expression shift from curiosity to irritation to the kind of weary recognition that came from a lifetime of dealing with this particular brand of bureaucratic harassment. They don't waste any time, do they? She said, setting the letter on the coffee table like it might bite her. Nope. I sat down next to her, close enough to smell the coconut oil she used in her hair. Question is, what exactly are we walking into? Danielle had grown up in Atlanta, knew the rhythms of neighborhoods like this better than I did. Her family had been fighting these battles for generations. Her grandmother had been one of the first black teachers to integrate the city's school system back in the 1960s. Her parents had been among the first black families to move into previously all-white suburbs in the 1980s. She understood the codes, the unspoken rules, the way seemingly neutral language could be weaponized. It's a setup, she said without hesitation. They're going to pack that room with friendly faces, present a united front, make us feel outnumbered and unwelcome. Then they'll bring up some minor violation, maybe your mailbox, maybe the way you parked the moving truck. Maybe the fact that Aaliyah's bike is visible in the front yard, and use it as justification for why we need to be more mindful of community standards. And if we don't show up, then we're non-compliant residents who don't respect the community process. They'll fine us, put liens on the property, make our lives miserable until we decide it's easier to sell and move somewhere else. I leaned back against the couch, processing the familiar catch-22. Show up and face a hostile crowd designed to intimidate us into submission. Skip it and hand them legitimate grounds for harassment. Either way, we lose. There's a third option, I said slowly, which is, we show up but we don't play defense. Danielle raised an eyebrow. She knew that tone. Had heard it the night I'd decided to start my own engineering consulting firm instead of continuing to work for companies that would never promote me past a certain level. It was the tone I used when I was done being patient, done being accommodating. Done letting other people set the terms of engagement. What are you thinking? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Margaret Hayes, HOA President. But also, and this was the part the Thompsons didn't know, a woman I'd worked with professionally for the past 3 years. I'm thinking it's time to level the playing field. The phone rang twice before Margaret answered. Jamal, is everything all right? Hey, Margaret. I got your letter about the HOA meeting. Wanted to touch base before Thursday. Oh. There was a long pause and I could practically hear her recalibrating. Yes, well, you know how these things go. Neighbors get concerned, they file complaints. I have to follow procedure. Margaret Hayes was a good woman. A black woman in her 60s who'd fought her own battles to become president of the Brookhaven Estates HOA. But she was also a politician. Someone who'd learned to navigate predominantly white spaces by being extra careful, extra diplomatic, extra willing to bend over backward to avoid conflict. What kind of complaints are we talking about? I asked, another pause. Jamal, you know I can't discuss specifics over the phone. That's what the meeting is for. Fair enough. But Margaret, you and I have worked together on enough projects that I think we understand each other. I'm hoping Thursday's meeting will be productive for everyone involved. The silence stretched out until I thought the call might have dropped. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice carefully neutral. I'm sure it will be, Jamal. I'm sure it will be. After I hung up, Danielle was watching me with a mixture of admiration and concern. You just put the HOA president on notice that you two have history. Mm-hmm. And you think that's going to help? I think Margaret Hayes is about to realize that the complaints she's been receiving aren't as straightforward as they seemed. I think she's going to do some digging before Thursday night. And I think what she finds is going to make for a very interesting meeting. And if you're wrong, I reached for the folder I kept in the coffee table drawer, the one labeled Brookhaven Development. Inside were contracts, blueprints, inspection reports, and correspondence dating back 5 years. Everything related to Richardson Engineering, consultants' involvement in the development and construction of Brookhaven Estates, including the structural engineering reports that had been required before any of these houses could be occupied, including the safety certifications that had been required before any families could move, and including the documentation showing that Richardson Engineering had been the primary consulting firm for the entire development. Then we'll have a very educational conversation about property values, community standards, and exactly who belongs in this neighborhood. Danielle picked up one of the contracts, scanning the technical language and official seals. You've been planning this. Not planning, preparing, there's a difference. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. The wariness was still there, but underneath it was something else. Pride maybe, or recognition. She'd married a man who knew how to fight, who'd spent years learning the systems that were designed to keep people like us out. She'd just watched me flip the script on people who thought they held all the cards. Thursday night is going to be interesting, she said. Yes, it is. The Thompsons have no idea what's coming, do they? I smiled, thinking about Rick Thompson's red MAGA hat, about Karen Thompson's assumptions, about the way they'd looked at our house like it was a tumor in their perfect neighborhood. Not a clue. From upstairs, we could hear Aaliyah practicing her dance routine for the school talent show, her feet thumping against the hardwood floor in rhythm to whatever song was playing on her tablet. The sound filled the house with energy and joy, a reminder of why we'd fought so hard to get here. Thursday night, I was going to make sure that joy was protected. The Thompsons wanted to play games about who belonged in Brookhaven Estates. Fine, let's play. But we were going to play by my rules, on my field, with cards they didn't even know existed. The meeting was going to be educational for everyone involved, but some people were going to learn more than others. Thursday arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made Atlanta feel like a steam bath. By 6:30 in the evening, the sky was the color of old pewter, promising rain that would probably hold off just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, adjusting my tie for the 3rd time. Navy blue suit, crisp white shirt, burgundy tie that Danielle had given me for my birthday, professional but not pretentious, authoritative but not arrogant. The armor I'd learned to wear into rooms where I needed people to see me as competent before they noticed I was black. You look like you're going to trial, Danielle said from the doorway, but her tone was affectionate. She understood the ritual, the way presentation could shift the entire dynamic of a confrontation. In a way, I am. I slipped my tablet into the leather portfolio case, along with the folder of documents I'd been reviewing all week. The question is whether I'm the defendant or the prosecutor. Daddy, why are you dressed so fancy? Aaliyah bounced into the room, still in her school clothes, completely oblivious to the tension that had been building all week. I have a meeting with some neighbors, I said, kneeling down to her level. Adult stuff. Very boring. Can I come? Not this time, baby girl. But Miss Johnson next door is going to come over and make popcorn with you while Mommy and Daddy are out. Mrs. Johnson was our one friendly neighbor so far, a retired teacher in her 70s who'd brought us cookies on our 2nd day and had spent an hour chatting with Aaliyah about her dance classes. A white woman who'd lived in Brookhaven for 20 years and seemed genuinely delighted to have new neighbors. Will you tell me about it when you get home? Aaliyah asked. Absolutely, I promised, though I had no idea what version of the story I'd be able to share with a 7-year-old. The Brookhaven Community Center was a 15-minute walk from our house, a brick building that tried to look colonial, but ended up looking like a bank. By the time we arrived, the parking lot was already half full, and I could see people streaming toward the entrance in small clusters. Showtime, Danielle murmured, linking her arm through mine. The meeting room was larger than I'd expected, with rows of folding chairs facing a small stage where a conference table had been set up. Margaret Hayes sat at the center of the table, flanked by 2 other HOA board members I didn't recognize. Maybe 40 people had shown up, which was a decent turnout for a Thursday night in suburbia. I scanned the room quickly, noting the demographics. Overwhelmingly white, skewing older with a few younger families scattered throughout. The Thompsons were in the 3rd row, Rick in his inevitable red cap, Karen in a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. There they are, Rick said loudly enough for half the room to hear, not bothering to turn around. Figured they'd show up. Always do when there's trouble brewing. Several people turned to look at us and I felt Danielle's grip tighten on my arm. This was the part she'd warned me about. The moment when we became the center of attention. When every conversation in the room would be about us, whether we were included or not. But instead of shrinking back, I smiled and nodded to the people who were staring. "Good evening," I said pleasantly, loud enough to carry. "Beautiful night for a community meeting." The response was a mixture of surprised nods and awkward silence. They'd expected us to skulk to the back row to keep our heads down and hope not to be noticed. Meeting their stares directly had shifted the dynamic just slightly, but enough to matter. We took seats in the 5th row, close enough to be engaged but far enough back to observe the room. I opened my portfolio and pulled out a legal pad, making a show of being prepared to take notes. Around us, conversations resumed, but with a different quality now, more subdued, more careful. At 7 o'clock sharp, Margaret Hayes called the meeting to order. She looked tired, older than I'd remembered from our previous professional interactions. Being caught between competing neighborhood factions was clearly taking its toll. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd run a lot of meetings. "We have several items on tonight's agenda, but I want to start by addressing the concerns that have been brought to the board's attention regarding property compliance and community standards. Here we go," I thought. Over the past week, the board has received multiple complaints about various issues in the neighborhood. Some of these complaints relate to maintenance standards, some to architectural modifications, and some to general concerns about community cohesion. Community cohesion. That was a new euphemism. Rick Thompson's hand shot up. "Margaret, if I may, I think we all know why we're here tonight. We have new residents who may not understand how things work in Brookhaven Estates. Maybe they come from a different kind of neighborhood. Maybe they're not used to our standards, but the fact is, property values are already starting to decline." A murmur ran through the room, some supportive, some uncomfortable. Karen Thompson nodded vigorously, and several other residents joined her. Margaret looked directly at me. "Mr. Richardson, you're welcome to respond to these concerns." I stood up slowly, buttoning my jacket. The room went quiet, every eye focused on me. This was the moment I'd been preparing for all week. But now that it was here, I felt the weight of it. Not just my family's future in this neighborhood, but something larger. The unspoken question that hung over every interaction like this. Would I back down or stand up? Would I make myself smaller to make them more comfortable? Or would I take up the space I'd earned? "Thank you, Margaret," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these concerns directly." I walked to the front of the room, facing the crowd. 40 pairs of eyes, most of them skeptical, some openly hostile, a few genuinely curious about what I might say. First, let me introduce myself properly. I'm Jamal Richardson, and this is my wife Danielle. We moved to Brookhaven Estates last week because we believe it's exactly the kind of community where we want to raise our daughter. We chose this neighborhood because of its reputation for excellence, for high standards, and for residents who take pride in their properties. So far, so diplomatic. I could see some heads nodding. Now, Mr. Thompson mentioned property values. That's certainly a legitimate concern for any homeowner. I'd be happy to share some data on that topic. I opened my tablet and pulled up the presentation I'd prepared. According to the most recent assessment data, properties in Brookhaven Estates have increased in value by an average of 8.3% over the past year, which is actually above the regional average of 6.7%. The neighborhood's diversity index has also increased slightly, which correlates with improved school ratings and increased commercial investment in the area. The numbers were real, pulled from public records and market analysis reports I'd commissioned through my business. I watched faces in the crowd shift from skeptical to surprised. But more importantly, I continued, I want to address the question of standards and community compliance. Because you're right, standards matter, quality matters, and residents should be held accountable for maintaining the character and value of this community. Rick Thompson was leaning forward in his chair, clearly not liking where this was going, which is why I'm sure you'll all be interested to know that every building in Brookhaven Estates was constructed under the direct supervision of Richardson engineering consultants. Every foundation was inspected by my firm, Every structural element was certified by my engineers. Every safety protocol was overseen by my company. The silence was absolute now. You could have heard a pin drop. Including, I said, looking directly at Rick Thompson, the house at 4249 Maple Grove Drive, which was completed 18 months ago and received final safety certification on March 15, 2023. Rick's face had gone pale beneath his red cap. That was his address, his house. So when we talk about standards, when we talk about quality, when we talk about the kind of professionals who belong in a community like Brookhaven Estates, I think we're having exactly the right conversation. I smiled pleasantly at the crowd. Any questions? The silence stretched out like a held breath, 40 people trying to process what they'd just heard, trying to reconcile the assumptions they'd walked in with against the reality standing in front of them. I could see the calculations happening in real time. Glances at Rick Thompson, whispered conversations. The slow realization that the evening wasn't going according to plan. Margaret Hayes was the first to recover, her politician's instincts kicking in. Mr. Richardson, thank you for that clarification. I think it's important for neighbors to understand each other's professional backgrounds. Absolutely, I agreed, still standing at the front of the room. Transparency builds trust, community cohesion, as you put it. From the third row, Karen Thompson's voice cut through the silence like a knife. That's all very interesting, but it doesn't address the real issues here. Here it comes, I thought. When facts don't support the argument, pivot to something harder to quantify. Karen stood up, smoothing down her dress with the kind of theatrical gesture that suggested she'd been preparing for this moment. We're not talking about professional qualifications. We're talking about fit, about whether certain elements are compatible with the community we've built here. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Elements, not people, elements. I've lived in Brookhaven for 12 years, she continued, her voice gaining confidence as she found her rhythm. I've seen what happens when neighborhoods change too quickly, when the wrong kind of families move in. Property values drop, schools decline, crime rates increase. It's not personal, it's just statistics. Danielle's hand found mine and squeezed. I could feel her tension, the way she was holding herself very still. She'd heard this speech before, we both had. The polite version of racism, wrapped in concern for property values and children's safety, delivered with the kind of tone that suggested the speaker was simply being realistic about unpleasant truths. What statistics are those, Mrs. Thompson? I asked calmly. The question clearly caught her off guard. She'd expected me to get defensive, to argue with her characterization, not to ask for specifics. Well, I mean, everyone knows, she started, then stopped. The data is readily available if you know where to look. I'd be interested in seeing that data, I said. As an engineer, I work with statistics every day. I'm always curious about methodology, sample sizes, control variables. Perhaps you could share your sources? A flush was creeping up Karen's neck, visible even under the community center's harsh fluorescent lighting. She'd made the classic mistake of assuming her audience would simply accept her assertions without questioning the foundation. I don't have the specific studies with me, she said stiffly. Of course not, but I do happen to have some data with me. I turned back to my tablet. For instance, did you know that Brookhaven Estates has one of the lowest crime rates in the entire Atlanta metropolitan area? In fact, the most recent police statistics show 0 reported break-ins, 0 incidents of vandalism, and 0 violent crimes in the past 18 months. I looked up at the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as possible. Those are pretty impressive statistics for a community that's supposedly in decline. Rick Thompson couldn't stay quiet any longer. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Look, we all know what this is really about. You can throw around all the numbers you want, but we know what we see. We know what happens when neighborhoods start changing. The mask was slipping now. The polite euphemisms were giving way to something rawer, more honest in its ugliness. What exactly do you see, Mr. Thompson? I asked. I see property values that are going to tank. I see families that don't share our values moving in and expecting us to adapt to them instead of the other way around. I see the beginning of the end for everything we've worked to build here. The room was riveted now, sensing that we'd moved past the pretense of civil discourse into something more volatile. Some faces showed discomfort at Rick's bluntness. Others showed agreement, and a few showed the kind of fascinated horror people felt when watching a car accident unfold. "Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice still calm but with an edge that cut through the tension. "I'm curious about something. You mentioned that you've worked to build this community. What exactly did you build?" "What do you mean?" "I mean specifically, what was your role in the development of Brookhaven Estates? Were you involved in the planning, the financing, the construction?" Rick's face was reddening now, and I could see him trying to figure out where I was going with this. "I've been a resident here since the beginning. I was one of the first homeowners. I helped establish the HOA, set up the community standards." "That's interesting, because according to the development records, the first phase of Brookhaven Estates broke ground in January 2019. Construction began in March 2019. The first homes were completed in September 2019. I pulled up another document on my tablet. "But according to county records, you purchased your home in October 2023. That's 4 years after construction began, and 2 years after the community was substantially complete." The silence was deafening. Rick's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "So when you talk about building this community," I continued, "you're actually talking about moving into a community that had already been built by other people, including the engineering firm that ensured every house met safety codes, that every street would support emergency vehicle access, that every utility connection would function properly." I closed the tablet and looked directly at him. "The same engineering firm that's owned by the man you're trying to convince doesn't belong here." Margaret Hayes cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should—" "No," Rick interrupted, his voice rising. "No, I'm not going to sit here and listen to this. I don't care what company you work for or how many degrees you have or how many houses you claim to have built. This neighborhood was fine before you got here, and it's going to hell now that you're here. That's not racism, that's just reality." "Reality according to whom?" Danielle spoke for the first time, standing up beside me. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the steel underneath. "According to the man who's been here less time than some of the trees in his front yard? According to the woman who claims to have statistics she can't produce? According to people who see one black family move into their neighborhood and immediately assume property values will collapse?" She took a step forward, and I'd never been prouder of my wife. "Let me tell you about reality, Mr. Thompson. Reality is that my husband has spent the last 15 years building communities like this one. Reality is that we saved for 12 years to afford a house in a neighborhood with good schools and safe streets. Reality is that we're here because we want the same things you want, a place where our daughter can grow up safe and happy." "Then act like it," Karen Thompson snapped. "Act like you understand what kind of neighborhood this is. Act like you want to fit in instead of making everyone else uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable how?" I asked. "By existing? By moving into a house we purchased legally? By following every HOA rule and regulation? Or by refusing to apologize for being here?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and I could see people in the crowd shifting uncomfortably. Because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? They weren't uncomfortable because we'd done anything wrong. They were uncomfortable because we existed in their space. Because our presence forced them to confront their assumptions about who belonged in neighborhoods like this. "You want to talk about community standards?" I continued. "Fine, let's talk about them. Let's talk about neighbors who welcome new residents instead of gossiping about them before they've even unpacked. Let's talk about community members who address concerns directly and respectfully instead of filing anonymous complaints. Let's talk about HOA board members who focus on actual violations instead of manufacturing problems where none exist." I turned to address the full room. "Because here's what I've learned in the week since we moved here. Most of you, the vast majority of you, are good people. You wave when we walk by. You've complimented our landscaping. You've been kind to our daughter. You're exactly the kind of neighbors we hope to have." Heads were nodding now, people recognizing themselves in that description. But a vocal minority has decided that our presence here is a problem to be solved instead of a community to be welcomed. And that minority has convinced some of you that property values and community standards are at risk, when the only thing actually at risk is the illusion that Brookhaven Estates is an exclusive club instead of a neighborhood. Margaret Hayes stood up, clearly ready to regain control of the meeting. "I think we've had a full airing of concerns tonight. Perhaps it's time to—" "Actually," I interrupted gently, "I have one more piece of information to share. Something I think the community should know. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a document I'd been saving for last. The nuclear option. This is a copy of the development contract between Brookhaven Development Corporation and Richardson Engineering Consultants. The contract that established my firm as the primary engineering consultant for this entire project. I held up the document so everyone could see the official seals and signatures. This contract includes a standard clause that gives Richardson Engineering Consultants first right of refusal on any future development or major renovation projects in Brookhaven Estates. It also includes a provision that allows us to review and approve any major changes to community infrastructure, including HOA policies that might affect property values or resident safety. The implication was clear, and I could see it dawning on faces throughout the room. The people who wanted to make our lives difficult were going to have to deal with us whether they liked it or not. Every major decision about their community's future would cross my desk. So when we talk about who belongs in Brookhaven Estates, I said, looking directly at Rick Thompson, maybe the question isn't whether my family deserves to be here. Maybe the question is whether this community deserves to have us. I closed my portfolio and looked around the room one final time. Thank you all for a very educational evening. I look forward to being neighbors with those of you who are interested in building a real community. As for the rest, I shrugged. Well, I'm not going anywhere, so you'll have plenty of time to get used to the idea. Danielle and I walked toward the exit and the crowd parted to let us through. As we reached the door, I heard Margaret Hayes calling the meeting back to order, but her voice sounded distant and uncertain. We stepped out into the humid evening air, and I felt like I could breathe again. How do you think that went? Danielle asked as we walked toward our car. I thought about Rick Thompson's face when he realized I held the engineering contracts for his house. I thought about Karen Thompson's inability to produce the statistics she'd cited. I thought about the way the room had shifted when people realized they'd been led into a fight they didn't understand. I think, I said, taking my wife's hand, we're going to be just fine. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that only comes after a storm has passed. I was in the kitchen making coffee and watching Aaliyah chase butterflies in the backyard. When the first knock came at our door, Mrs. Johnson stood on our front porch, holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the kind of apologetic expression that immediately put me on guard. "Good morning, Jamal. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. Mrs. Johnson, come in." I stepped aside to let her enter, noting how she glanced around nervously before crossing the threshold. "I brought you and Danielle some breakfast casserole," she said, setting the dish on our counter. "Thought you might need some comfort food after last night. You heard about the meeting?" She gave me a look that suggested I was being naive. "Honey, in a neighborhood this size, everyone heard about the meeting." By 10 o'clock last night, my phone was ringing off the hook. Danielle appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her robe, drawn by the sound of voices. "Morning, Mrs. Johnson, that smells wonderful." "Just a little something to show support," the older woman said. "I wanted you to know that not everyone in Brookhaven thinks like the Thompsons." She settled into one of our kitchen chairs, with the deliberate movement of someone who had something important to say. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 23 years, watched it grow from a handful of houses to what it is now. And I've seen this story before." "What story is that?" I asked, pouring coffee for all three of us. "The story of families like yours moving in and certain residents deciding it's the end of the world." She accepted the coffee gratefully. "Happened with the Patels when they bought the house on Oak Street. Happened with the Gonzalez family when they moved to Elm. Same complaints, same fears about property values, same coded language about community standards." Danielle sat down across from her. "What happened to those families?" "The Patels moved away after 6 months. Said they were tired of fighting. The Gonzalez family lasted 2 years, but eventually they got worn down too." Mrs. Johnson's expression hardened. "Shame, really." Both were lovely families, but Rick and Karen Thompson have a talent for making people feel unwelcome. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "How many families have left?" "3 that I know of personally. Probably others who decided it wasn't worth the battle." She looked at both of us seriously. "That's why last night was so important. First time anyone ever stood up to them and had the ammunition to back it up." The phone rang before I could respond. Danielle answered, her expression shifting from neutral to surprise to something approaching amusement. "Yes, this is Danielle Richardson. Yes, we're new to the neighborhood." She covered the phone with her hand and whispered to us, Channel 5 News. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. News? Apparently someone uploaded video of last night's meeting to social media. It's going viral. She uncovered the phone. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? You want to do a story about what? For the next 10 minutes, I listened to my wife field questions from a local news producer about the HOA meeting that's taking the internet by storm. Apparently, someone in the crowd had been live streaming the meeting, and clips of my presentation had been shared thousands of times overnight. When Danielle finally hung up, Mrs. Johnson was grinning like she'd won the lottery. I knew it, she said, clapping her hands together. I told Harold, that's my husband. I told him that boy was going to be trouble for the Thompsons. Good trouble. This is getting bigger than I expected, I admitted. Honey, you embarrassed a man wearing a MAGA hat in front of his neighbors by proving you built his house. In today's world, that's social media gold. She wasn't wrong. Over the next hour, as I scrolled through Twitter and TikTok, I found dozens of posts about the engineer who owned his HOA. The clips had been edited down to the highlights. Rick Thompson claiming he'd built the community, my revelation about the engineering contracts, Karen Thompson's inability to produce her statistics. The comments were largely supportive, but they revealed something I hadn't fully considered. Our story wasn't just about neighborhood drama. It had become a symbol of something larger, a moment when preparation met opportunity and created a perfect reversal of expectations. Daddy, why are people on the computer talking about our house? Aaliyah had wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the unusual level of activity. Some people are interested in the work Daddy does, I said, closing my laptop. But it's not really about the house. It's about neighbors learning to be nice to each other. She considered this with 7-year-old logic. The man with the red hat isn't very nice. No, sweetheart. He's not. Will you make him be nice? I looked at my daughter's earnest face, at the expectation that adults could fix problems simply by deciding to fix them. I can't make anyone be nice, baby girl. But I can make sure he doesn't stop us from being happy in our home. Mrs. Johnson stood to leave but paused at the door. Jamal, there's something else you should know. Margaret Hayes called me this morning. Apparently, she's been getting calls from other HOA boards around the city, people wanting to know about hiring Richardson Engineering for their own developments. I felt my eyebrows rise. Seriously? Turns out standing up to bullies in public is good for business. Who would have thought? She grinned again. I suspect the Thompsons are discovering that their little campaign to make you uncomfortable has had some unintended consequences. After she left, Danielle and I sat in our kitchen, processing the strange turn our lives had taken overnight. The meeting had been about containing a problem. Instead, it had become something else entirely, a moment of visibility that neither of us had anticipated. How do you feel about all this attention? Danielle asked. I thought about it carefully. The social media posts felt good in the moment, but they also meant our story was now public in ways we hadn't chosen. Our neighbors would be dealing with strangers driving through the neighborhood, maybe news crews, certainly more scrutiny than anyone had signed up for. Honestly, I feel like we've won a battle but not the war. Rick and Karen Thompson aren't going to disappear just because they got embarrassed. If anything, this might make them more determined. Or it might make them more careful. Maybe, but careful racists are often more dangerous than obvious ones. The rest of the morning brought a steady stream of visitors, neighbors we'd barely met, stopping by to introduce themselves. A few phone calls from local media, and one unexpected visitor who made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about our situation. Margaret Hayes arrived around noon, alone and looking tired. She accepted our offer of coffee but didn't touch the cup, instead sitting rigidly in our living room like she was preparing for an unpleasant medical procedure. I owe you an apology, she said without preamble. I let things get out of hand last night. I should have shut down the Thompsons' rhetoric before it escalated. You were in a difficult position, I said diplomatically. No, I wasn't. I was in a position to show leadership, and instead I tried to manage competing interests. That's not leadership, that's politics, and there's a difference. She finally took a sip of coffee, gathering herself. I want you to know that I've spoken with the other board members this morning. We're implementing new policies for community meetings. No personal attacks, no unsubstantiated claims, no discussion of residents' qualifications to live here. What about the complaints against us? Margaret looked embarrassed. There were no legitimate complaints. Karen Thompson filed 3 separate reports about your mailbox, your landscaping, and the color of your front door, all of which are in full compliance with HOA standards. The only other complaint was Rick Thompson claiming your moving truck was parked illegally, but that was on a public street and didn't violate any regulations. So it had been exactly what we'd suspected. Manufactured controversy designed to create grounds for harassment. Margaret, Danielle said gently, how many other families have been through this process? The HOA president's shoulders sagged. Too many. And I'm ashamed to say that most of them didn't have the resources to fight back the way you did. They just left. Why are you telling us this? Because I'm tired of being part of the problem. Because I'm tired of watching good families get driven out of a neighborhood they have every right to call home. And because, she paused, looking directly at me, because I've been thinking about what you said last night, about whether this community deserves to have you. The weight of that statement settled over the room. Margaret Hayes was essentially admitting that the HOA had been complicit in a pattern of racial harassment, and that our presence was forcing a long overdue reckoning. What happens now? I asked. Now we do better. We change the policies, we hold people accountable, and we make sure this never happens to another family. She stood to leave, then turned back. And Jamal, thank you for not backing down. Someone needed to call us out on our bullshit. After she left, I found myself standing in our backyard, watching Aaliyah practice her dance routine on the patio. The sun was shining, the grass was green, and our daughter was dancing without a care in the world. We'd won something important last night, but the victory felt complicated. We'd proven we belonged here, but in doing so, we'd also exposed something ugly about the community we'd chosen to join. The question now was whether the exposure would lead to healing or just make the wound more visible. Either way, there was no going back. We were part of Brookhaven Estates now, for better or worse. And if our presence forced this community to confront its own contradictions, well, maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Change is uncomfortable, but sometimes discomfort is exactly what's needed. 3 weeks had passed since the meeting, as it had become known throughout Brookhaven Estates. The viral clips had died down, the news crews had moved on to other stories, and life had settled into something resembling normal. But I knew better than to mistake quiet for peace. I was in my home office, reviewing blueprints for a new development project in Decatur, when I heard the sound that every parent dreads, the crash of a bicycle hitting pavement, followed by the distinctive wail of a hurt child. I was out the door before my brain fully processed what I'd heard, running toward the sound. In the street in front of our house, Aaliyah was sitting on the asphalt next to her overturned bike, holding her knee and crying. Blood seeped between her fingers and her school uniform was torn at the elbow. Baby, what happened? I knelt beside her, gently moving her hands to assess the damage. The knee was scraped but not deep. The elbow looked worse, but nothing that couldn't be handled with antiseptic and bandages. I was riding to Emma's house, she sobbed. But there were nails in the street and they popped my tire and I fell. Nails. I looked around and saw them scattered across the asphalt. About a dozen roofing nails. Too many and too evenly distributed to be accidental. Someone had thrown them there deliberately. The cold fury that settled over me was different from anything I'd felt before. Threatening me was one thing. Going after my 7-year-old daughter was something else entirely. Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you cleaned up. I helped Aaliyah to her feet and was guiding her toward the house when I heard footsteps behind us. Is she okay? I turned to see Rick Thompson approaching, his face showing what looked like genuine concern. For a moment, I wondered if I'd misjudged the nail situation. Maybe it really had been an accident. She'll be fine, I said carefully. Just some scrapes. Rick nodded, but something in his expression struck me as off. Not worried enough for someone who'd just witnessed a child get hurt. More like someone trying to gauge how much damage had been done. Kids and bicycles, he said with a forced chuckle, always getting into trouble. Maybe she should stick to riding on the sidewalk from now on. The implication was clear: stay off the street. Stay in your place. Maybe people should clean up their construction debris, I replied evenly. Construction debris? The nails. Someone scattered roofing nails across the street. Probably fell off a truck or something. Rick's eyes flicked toward the scattered nails, then back to me. Imagine that. But he didn't look surprised. He looked like someone whose plan had worked exactly as intended. After getting Aaliyah patched up and settled inside with ice cream and cartoons, I went back outside to collect the nails. As I knelt in the street photographing their distribution pattern with my phone, Mrs. Johnson approached from her house. "I saw what happened," she said without preamble. "That poor baby. Is she all right?" "She'll be fine. But I don't think this was an accident." Mrs. Johnson glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "It wasn't. I was in my garden this morning and saw Rick Thompson walking around out here with a small bag. Didn't think much of it at the time, but now..." The confirmation hit like a physical blow. Bad enough to scatter nails randomly, hoping to damage property. But to do it on a street where children rode bikes, knowing a specific child rode bikes, that crossed a line I hadn't imagined anyone would cross. Did anyone else see? Margaret Hayes was jogging by around the same time. She might have noticed something. Mrs. Johnson's expression was grim. "Jamal, this has gone beyond neighborhood disputes. This is criminal." She was right. Whatever games the Thompsons had been playing before, sabotaging a child's bicycle crossed into territory that demanded a different kind of response. I spent the next hour making phone calls. First to the police, who took a report but made it clear that proving intent would be difficult. Then to Margaret Hayes, who was horrified and promised to launch an internal HOA investigation. Finally, to my lawyer, who explained the various civil remedies available but cautioned that litigation would be expensive and time-consuming, all of which missed the point. This wasn't about legal remedies or HOA investigations. This was about the fact that someone in my neighborhood had deliberately endangered my child, and traditional channels weren't going to provide the kind of resolution that would prevent it from happening again. That evening, after Aaliyah was in bed, I sat in my office staring at the photographs of the nails, trying to decide what kind of father I wanted to be. The kind who filed reports and hoped the system would protect his family, or the kind who took more direct action. The decision was made for me the next morning. I was loading Aaliyah's bike into my truck to take it for tire repair when Karen Thompson appeared in her front yard, ostensibly watering flowers, but obviously positioned to make conversation. "How's your daughter doing?" she called out, her voice carrying just the right note of neighborly concern. "She's fine, thank you." "Such a shame about those nails. You really should teach her to be more careful on her bicycle." The casual victim blaming was delivered with a smile, but the message was unmistakable. This was her fault for riding where she didn't belong. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, I should thank you." She looked puzzled. "Thank me? Your husband's little nail project yesterday gave me exactly the documentation I needed for something I've been working on." The color drained from Karen's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't, but fortunately, security cameras don't lie." I gestured toward Mrs. Johnson's house, where a small camera was visible under the eaves. "High-definition video of your husband distributing roofing nails across a public street. Time-stamped, dated, admissible in court." I hadn't actually seen the video yet, but Mrs. Johnson had confirmed that her security system had been recording. Karen didn't know that, though, plus witness testimony from multiple neighbors who observed his activities. I closed the truck tailgate with deliberate emphasis. Really makes for a compelling case of reckless endangerment, don't you think? Karen was backing toward her house now, the garden hose forgotten. Rick was he was cleaning up debris from the construction site down the street. At 7 in the morning? In front of my house specifically? While carrying a bag of new nails? I shook my head. "Mrs. Thompson, you might want to suggest that your husband lawyer up. Because endangering children tends to make prosecutors very motivated." I got in my truck and drove away, leaving Karen standing in her yard with water pooling around her feet from the abandoned hose. In my rearview mirror, I could see her pulling out her phone, undoubtedly calling Rick to warn him that their escalation had backfired spectacularly. The truth was, I probably didn't have enough evidence for criminal charges, but I didn't need criminal charges. I just needed the Thompsons to believe I had them, to understand that their actions had consequences, and to realize that endangering my daughter had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. More importantly, I needed them to understand that I wasn't the kind of father who would let threats to his child go unanswered. That afternoon, while Aaliyah was at school, I received an unexpected visitor. Rick Thompson stood on my front porch looking older than his 56 years, his usual bluster replaced by something that might have been fear. "We need to talk," he said. "Do we? I didn't invite him in." Didn't move from the doorway. Look, maybe things got a little out of hand yesterday. Maybe some debris got scattered around accidentally, but nobody meant for anyone to get hurt. Accidentally. Yeah, accidentally. He was sweating now, despite the cool October air. The thing is, I've got a family too. I've got grandkids who visit. Maybe we can work something out here, neighbor to neighbor. I studied his face, seeing desperation where I'd once seen arrogance. What kind of something? Maybe we all just step back. Maybe everyone keeps to themselves, minds their own business. Maybe certain people stop filing reports and making phone calls to lawyers. In exchange for what? In exchange for no more accidents. No more misunderstandings. No more problems for anybody. It was a negotiation, I realized. He was scared enough to come to my door and bargain for peace, but not sorry enough to admit what he'd done. Still, it was progress. Mr. Thompson, I said carefully, let me be very clear about something. If my daughter gets hurt again, if she trips on mysteriously placed objects, if her bike gets vandalized, if she faces any kind of harassment or intimidation, I won't be calling lawyers or filing reports. I'll be having a very different kind of conversation with you. Do you understand me? He nodded quickly. Understood. Completely understood. Good. Now get off my property. He left without another word, and I watched him walk back to his house with the careful steps of someone who'd just realized he was in deeper water than he'd anticipated. That evening, as I helped Aaliyah with her homework at the kitchen table, she looked up at me with those serious 7-year-old eyes. Daddy, are we safe in our house? The question hit me like a punch to the chest. Of course we are, baby girl. Why would you ask that? Emma's mom said some people in the neighborhood don't like us. She said we might have to move. I set down the pencil I'd been holding and pulled Aaliyah onto my lap. Listen to me, sweetheart. This is our home. We bought it, we love it, and we're not going anywhere. Some people might not like change, but that's their problem to solve, not ours. But what if they keep being mean? I thought about Rick Thompson on my doorstep, about Karen Thompson's manufactured concern, about the pattern of harassment that had driven other families away from Brookhaven Estates. Then we'll deal with it, I said finally, because Richardsons don't run from problems. We face them, we solve them, and we make things better. That's what Daddy does at work, and that's what we do as a family. Aaliyah nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the trust that children place in their parents. But as I helped her finish her math homework, I wondered if I was making promises I couldn't keep. The Thompsons had been willing to endanger a child to make their point. They'd crossed lines I hadn't imagined anyone would cross. And while Rick's visit suggested they might be backing down, I'd learned not to mistake tactical retreats for genuine surrender. The real test wasn't whether we could win a single confrontation or survive a moment of viral fame. The real test was whether we could build a life here, whether Aaliyah could grow up feeling safe and secure, whether we could transform a neighborhood that had barely tolerated our presence into a community that actually welcomed our participation. That was going to take more than engineering reports and viral videos. It was going to take time, patience, and the kind of everyday courage that turned neighbors into allies and allies into friends. But as I tucked Aaliyah into bed that night, listening to her chatter about her school friends and her dance classes and her plans for Halloween, I felt something I hadn't felt since we'd moved to Brookhaven Estates. Hope, not naive hope, not wishful thinking, but the solid, grounded hope that comes from knowing you face the worst someone can throw at you and still manage to protect what matters most. We belonged here, and slowly, one conversation and one confrontation at a time, we were going to make sure everyone else knew it too. 6 months later, I stood in my backyard watching Aaliyah's 8th birthday party unfold with the kind of chaotic joy that only a dozen 8-year-olds can create. The October afternoon was perfect, crisp but warm, with leaves just starting to turn and the smell of Mrs. Johnson's apple pie drifting over the fence. "Daddy, come push us on the swings." Aaliyah called from the swing set we'd installed in March. She was wearing a purple dress that she'd picked out specifically because it sparkled when you spin, and her friends surrounded her like a flock of colorful birds. Half these kids lived in Brookhaven Estates, children of neighbors who'd initially been skeptical, but had gradually warmed to the idea that diversity might not be the neighborhood apocalypse they'd feared. The other half came from Aaliyah's school, a mix of backgrounds that reflected the Atlanta she was growing up in, black and white and brown and everything in between. In a minute, Baby girl, I called back, but I was smiling as I said it. Danielle appeared beside me, carrying a tray of juice boxes and wearing the slightly frazzled expression of someone who'd spent the morning transforming our house into a party venue. "How are you feeling?" she asked, bumping my shoulder with hers. "Good," I said, and realized I meant it completely. Really good. It had been a long 6 months. The viral fame from the HOA meeting had faded, but its effects had lingered. 3 new black families had moved to Brookhaven Estates, each one reaching out to us for advice about navigating neighborhood politics. Richardson Engineering had received enough new contracts to hire 2 additional staff members. And the Thompsons? Well, the Thompsons had become a different kind of problem. Not because they'd escalated. Rick's nail scattering had been their high-water mark of harassment. But because they'd become increasingly isolated as other neighbors realized what they'd been doing. The security camera footage of Rick deliberately distributing nails in the street had eventually surfaced, along with Mrs. Johnson's testimony about the pattern of complaints against minority families. The revelation had split the neighborhood into 2 camps, those who were horrified by the behavior, and those who quietly supported it but weren't willing to say so publicly. The Thompsons had put their house up for sale in August. "Mr. Richardson?" A small voice interrupted my thoughts. I looked down to see Emma, one of Aaliyah's school friends, tugging on my sleeve. "Aaliyah said you built all the houses in the neighborhood. Is that true?" "I helped," I said, crouching down to her level. "My company made sure they were safe and strong." "Even that one?" She pointed toward the Thompson house where a sold sign had appeared the day before. "Even that one?" Emma nodded seriously. "That's cool. I want to build houses when I grow up." "Then you should study math and science," I told her. "And if you ever have questions about engineering, you can ask me." She beamed and ran back toward the swing set, shouting to Aaliyah about her career plans. I watched her go, thinking about the casual way she'd accepted the idea of building things, of creating structures that would shelter families. For Emma, there was nothing remarkable about a black man being an engineer. It was just what Aaliyah's daddy did. That was the gift we'd given our daughter, I realized. Not just a house in a good neighborhood, not just access to better schools and safer streets. We'd given her a world where she could dream without boundaries, where her friends took her father's expertise for granted, where belonging wasn't something she had to fight for. It was something she simply possessed. "Daddy." Aaliyah's voice carried across the yard with renewed urgency. "Mrs. Hayes is here." I looked toward the gate to see Margaret Hayes approaching with a wrapped gift and a slightly nervous smile. In the month since the HOA meeting, our relationship had evolved from professional courtesy to something approaching friendship. She'd proven her commitment to change by implementing new policies and personally welcoming each new minority family to the neighborhood. "Margaret," I said, walking over to greet her, "you didn't have to bring anything. Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss Aaliyah's birthday." She handed me the gift, something soft and book-shaped. "Besides, I have some news I wanted to share. Good news, I hope? The best. The county has approved our proposal for the new community center. Richardson Engineering is officially the primary contractor for the project." I felt my eyebrows rise. The community center had been discussed for years but never funded. It would be a significant project, a multi-million-dollar facility that would serve not just Brookhaven Estates but several surrounding neighborhoods. "Margaret, that's incredible." "Thank you. Don't thank me. Your proposal was the best. Your firm has the strongest track record in the county, and..." She paused, looking around at the party scene. "And I think it's important that the children in this community see people who look like them, building the places where they'll grow up." Before I could respond, a commotion erupted near the swing set. 2 of the boys had gotten into an argument about whose turn it was, and tears were threatening. Danielle was already moving to intervene, but Aaliyah beat her to it. "Hey," my daughter said, stepping between the boys with the natural authority of the birthday girl, "we don't fight at parties. Marcus, you can go first, but only for 5 minutes. Then it's Tyler's turn, okay?" Both boys nodded, crisis averted. Aaliyah had inherited her mother's diplomatic skills along with my stubborn determination, a combination that was going to serve her well in whatever world she chose to build for herself. "She's going to be something special," Margaret observed. "She already is." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself moving through the party with a sense of deep contentment. Mrs. Johnson had brought homemade ice cream and stayed to help serve. The Martinez family from down the street had come with their twin daughters, who immediately bonded with Aaliyah over their shared love of dance. Even the Patel family, who'd moved back to the neighborhood in April after hearing about the changes, had stopped by with their teenage son who'd volunteered to help with party games. This was what community looked like, I thought. Not the artificial harmony that came from excluding anyone who might cause discomfort, but the genuine connections that formed when people chose to see each other as neighbors rather than threats. Around sunset, as parents began collecting their children and the party wound down, I found myself alone in the backyard for a few minutes. The decorations were slightly worse for wear. The lawn was littered with paper plates and juice box straws, and someone had definitely spilled cake frosting on the patio furniture. It looked like the aftermath of a celebration, like a space where joy had been thoroughly enjoyed. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Danielle appeared beside me, carrying a garbage bag and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose party had been a complete success. "Just thinking about how far we've come," I said. "From the HOA meeting? From moving day. Remember how scared we were? How we wondered if we'd made the right choice?" Danielle nodded, leaning against me as we surveyed our slightly destroyed but thoroughly loved backyard. "Do you think we did? Make the right choice?" I thought about Rick Thompson's red hat and manufactured outrage. I thought about Karen Thompson's statistics that didn't exist and her assumptions that did. I thought about the families who'd been driven away before us, and the families who'd found the courage to move here after us. I thought about Aaliyah, currently inside showing her friends her room and her books and her dance trophies, completely at ease in her own home, surrounded by children who accepted her presence as naturally as they accepted gravity. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think we did." The last guests left around 8 o'clock, and we spent another hour cleaning up while Aaliyah sorted through her birthday presents. She was particularly excited about the book Margaret Hayes had brought, a biography of Mae Jemison, the first black woman astronaut, and kept reading passages aloud as we worked. "Daddy, did you know she was an engineer too, before she became an astronaut?" "I did know that. Maybe I could be an astronaut engineer. Build space stations and then live in them." "Maybe you could," I agreed, and meant it completely. After Aaliyah was finally in bed, exhausted but happy, Danielle and I sat on our front porch with glasses of wine and watched the neighborhood settle into evening quiet. Lights were coming on in houses up and down the street, families going through their own bedtime routines, the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. "So what's next?" Danielle asked. "Next?" "For us, for the neighborhood. For whatever project you're going to tackle next." I considered the question. The community center would keep me busy for the next 2 years. Aaliyah was settled in school and making friends. Danielle loved her new teaching position and had been asked to join the curriculum committee. We'd found our rhythm here, our place in the complex ecosystem of Brookhaven Estates. "I think next is just this," I said finally. "Living here. Being neighbors. Showing up for school events and HOA meetings and block parties. Being the family that other families can count on. That's it? No grand gestures? No dramatic confrontations?" I smiled, thinking about the man I'd been 6 months ago, walking into that community center with a portfolio full of contracts and a heart full of anger. That man had been fighting for the right to exist in this space. The man sitting on this porch was ready to help shape what this space could become. The grand gesture was staying, I said. Everything else is just life. A comfortable silence settled between us, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of wind through the trees we'd planted that spring. Tomorrow I'd wake up and go to work designing buildings that would shelter families. Danielle would wake up and go teach children who might grow up to design their own buildings. Aaliyah would wake up and go to school with friends who saw her as just another kid in their class. It was ordinary. It was exactly what we'd hoped for when we'd first turned that key in our front door, and it had taken everything we had to make it possible. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Danielle said quietly. "What?" "That first night when we heard the Thompsons talking about those people. How small it made me feel, how unwelcome." I remembered. The weight that had settled on my shoulders, the familiar burden of representing not just my family but everyone who looked like us. And now I think about Aaliyah's friends asking you about engineering, about Margaret Hayes trusting us with the community center project, about Emma wanting to build houses when she grows up. She took my hand, intertwining our fingers. "We changed the story, Jamal. Not just for us, but for everyone who comes after us. She was right. The Brookhaven Estates that Aaliyah was growing up in was different from the one we'd moved into. Not perfect, probably never perfect, but better. More open. More willing to see newcomers as potential neighbors rather than inevitable problems. That was worth fighting for. That was worth staying for. As we headed inside for the night, I paused at our mailbox, the one I'd installed that first week, with Richardson etched in bold letters across brushed steel. In the glow of the streetlight, those letters looked solid and permanent, like they'd always been there, like they belonged. We all did. 5 years later. The phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, jarring me awake with the particular urgency that early morning calls always carry. I fumbled for it in the dark, trying not to wake Danielle. "Mr. Richardson, this is Janet Martinez from Channel 5 News. I'm sorry to call so early, but we're following up on a story from a few years ago." I sat up, suddenly wide awake. "What story?" "The viral HOA meeting video. The one where you confronted your neighbors about belonging in Brookhaven Estates. We're doing a Where Are They Now piece, and I was hoping we could interview you about how things have changed." I walked to the kitchen, stepping carefully around the cat we'd adopted last year. Through the window I could see the neighborhood coming to life. Joggers starting their morning routes, dogs being walked, the school bus making its first round. "How did you find me?" "Your community center project made the news again. The grand opening is next month, right?" I thought it might be interesting to connect that success back to the original story. The Brookhaven Community Center had taken 3 years to complete, but it was everything we'd hoped for and more. A 25,000 square foot facility with a gymnasium, meeting rooms, a computer lab, and a library branch. More importantly, it had become a gathering place for the increasingly diverse community that Brookhaven Estates had become. "I appreciate the interest," I said, "but I'm not sure there's much of a story left to tell." "Really?" "Because from what I can see, quite a lot has changed. The neighborhood demographics, the property values, which have increased significantly, by the way. The fact that you're now president of the HOA. That last part still surprised me sometimes. Margaret Hayes had stepped down the previous year, and the board had asked me to take over. The vote hadn't been unanimous, but it had been decisive enough to send a clear message about the direction the community wanted to go. "Let me ask you this," the reporter continued. "Do you feel like you've accomplished what you set out to do?" I thought about that as I started the coffee maker. What had we set out to do? Buy a house, raise our daughter in a good neighborhood, live peacefully among our neighbors. Simple goals that had required extraordinary effort. "We never set out to accomplish anything beyond being good neighbors," I said finally. "Everything else just happened." "But you changed an entire community. The community changed itself. We just gave it a reason to examine what kind of place it wanted to be." After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen watching the sun rise over Brookhaven Estates. 13-year-old Aaliyah would be getting up soon for school, probably complaining about some drama with her friends or excitement about the spring dance recital. Danielle would emerge from her morning run, energized and ready to tackle whatever challenges her middle school students would throw at her. Ordinary family life. Exactly what we'd hoped for. The Thompson house had been sold twice since Rick and Karen left. The first buyers had been a young Latino couple with twin toddlers. The second, after they'd relocated for work, had been an elderly black professor and his artist wife. Both families had integrated seamlessly into the neighborhood, their presence accepted as naturally as the changing seasons. That was the real victory, I thought. Not the viral video or the community center or even being elected HOA president. The real victory was that Aaliyah was growing up in a place where belonging wasn't something you had to fight for, it was something you simply possessed by virtue of calling a place home. My phone buzzed with a text message. Margaret Hayes checking in about the community center's grand opening event. "Everything set for next month?" "The mayor's office confirmed they'll be there," I typed back. "All good. Thanks for everything, Margaret. Thank you for showing us who we could be." I smiled, remembering the nervous woman who'd called that first HOA meeting, caught between competing pressures and unsure how to navigate them. Margaret had found her courage and used it to help transform not just our neighborhood but several others, where she now consulted on diversity and inclusion initiatives. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured 2 cups, adding cream to Danielle's the way she liked it. Upstairs, I could hear movement. Aaliyah getting ready for school. Danielle finishing her morning routine. In a few hours, I'd drive to the community center construction site for the final walkthrough before opening. This afternoon, I'd pick up Aaliyah from dance class and listen to her chatter about her day. This evening, we'd have dinner as a family and help her with homework and argue about screen time limits. Ordinary life. Beautiful, ordinary life. The kind of life that's only possible when home is truly home. When belonging is unquestioned. When children can dream without limits because the adults in their lives have fought to make dreams possible. That morning, as I carried coffee upstairs to my wife and called to my daughter that breakfast would be ready in 10 minutes, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel when we'd first moved to Brookhaven Estates. Gratitude. Not gratitude for being allowed to stay, but gratitude for being given the opportunity to prove that home is something you build, not something you're granted. That belonging is something you create through the daily work of showing up, contributing, caring about the people around you. 5 years ago, Rick Thompson had stood in a community center and declared that we didn't belong in his neighborhood. He'd been wrong about so many things. But mostly, he'd been wrong about whose neighborhood it was. It had never been his. It had never been ours either. It had always belonged to the people who were willing to do the work of building community, of creating space where everyone could thrive, of choosing connection over comfort. We'd just been the ones willing to prove it.